when Cook and the Western explorers first encountered the Polynesian navigators, and they were astounded at how good these navigators were. Frankly, they were better than the Europeans. And they said, how do you figure out how you not miss the island? And the navigators looked at them and said, what do you mean miss the island? We don't go past the island goes past us.
Well, hello, kia ora, and welcome to the Futures Workshop, a series of conversations with the world's leading futurists about the tools they've created. Today's episode is a special episode. It was recorded live at the Dubai Future Forum conference Victoria Mulligan has just returned from. She's back with me in the Auckland studio. Kia ora.
Kia ora, hello.
Tell us about the Dubai Future Forum.
Well, it's the world's largest gathering of futurists. Gives us the opportunity to come together, and for the 2024 edition, it continued to promote the highest quality of thought leadership on foresight and futurism from around the globe. And it really, truly is a very global conference. So through presentations, immersive workshops, interactive sessions, participants get to speak about the future, but also engage in really hands-on exploration of it too.
You were there as a participant, but also as a speaker, and it sounds like those few days are just completely full on.
Oh, yeah, it is a big deal. I mean, there's 2,500 people in attendance, something like 150 speakers. It's very curated, beautifully curated, I'd say, as well. And there's been learning from the last few conferences that have been held. This year they did the 2 conference days, but bookended that the first day with a networking day where they got to, we got to connect with our peers and people from around the world. And finally, a learning day at the other end of the conference where there was the opportunity to be a bit more hands-on and participatory when it came to workshops and learning about futures.
And one of the most exciting aspects of it is the venue.
Yes, it is based at the Museum of the Future in the middle of Dubai, and it really is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. Look it up if you haven't seen it already. The architecture is outstanding. It is quite an out-of-this-world looking structure, and worth having a look at just for the fun of it.
Okay. So as to the program of the Dubai Future Forum, lots of panels, lots of talks, and they had this podcast lounge, and you managed to get a couple of slots in there. So what was the setup?
It was nice. It was very comfortable. So quite an intimate space. We had the sound and the video crew, had a lovely audience of people who have the opportunity to be up close and personal with these people, with these speakers that for the most part you would only ever really get to see on a main stage. So it was a great opportunity to be able to have, I guess, a more personal conversation with some of these people.
Sadly, not quite enough room in the podcast lounge for your producer who is home looking after the children. But anyway, we won't talk about that. Why did you want to talk to Paul Saffo?
So Paul has been involved in the field of futures in the broader sense for a very long time. He is Silicon Valley based, so can talk to technology trends with authority, but he's equally knowledgeable and well versed when it comes to philosophical debates, geopolitics, the ancient empire of the Aztecs. He is the most well-read human I think I have ever met. He's a walking encyclopedia, that man.
And I understand he's a bit of a star in the futures field.
Yes, he is. So he teaches foresight at Stanford University. He is the adjunct professor at the School of Engineering. He advises corporates, NGOs, and governmental clients worldwide. And he was definitely one of the big celebrities at the event. So it was very hard to walk more than 10 metres with him without being stopped for a comment or a compliment or regularly a selfie. He is very generous with all of that, with his brain and his willingness to share and to act with curiosity. And I think that's pretty special, to be that big of a deal and still be actively leaning into learning and to asking questions and to growing. Sure. It was great.
And this conversation is a little different to our normal setup. Usually we'll pick one specific tool, but not this time.
No, not this time. So Paul knows all of the tools, and he is trying to learn and understand some of the new ones that are coming through. He asked questions about Indigenous approaches to futures thinking that we're seeing in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But he's very interested in the way in which we approach tools. He offers a really interesting critique on why and how to use them, and I think that's a really important discussion to be having right now.
Very good. Well, looking forward to this chat. Here is Victoria's conversation with Paul Saffo, recorded at the Dubai Future Forum 2024.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Victoria Mulligan, tōku ingoa, no Tamaki Makaurau, Aotearoa, aho. Hello, welcome to the Futures Workshop podcast, a series of conversations with the world's leading futurists about the tools they've created and they work with. Welcome, Paul Saffo.
Thank you.
So, Paul, this topic or this specific angle around foresight tools was something that you and I had talked about prior to the show. Can you tell me a little bit about your interest in the question of how we use tools?
How we use tools.
How we use tools.
Well, it turns out that as long as anybody has looked into the future, they have imagined that if they could just find the right tool, we would be effective at looking into the future. And some tools have been remarkably effective, including tools that people today would not take seriously. Crystal balls, reading tea leaves, inhaling vapors in a cave. That one worked for almost 1,000 years. And the important thing about that is the whole point of method is to give you a structured approach to get to a stage of insight and robust intuition about the future. And so in that sense, which tool you use doesn't matter so much as long as you have a process that works for you.
Right, so just to be super clear, you're not telling us to throw out all of the foresight tools and start from scratch?
Absolutely not. What I'm saying is, like any good tool, use the tool for the right purpose. In foresight, the two mistakes people most commonly make with tools is they will tend to use a tool the way a drunk uses a lamppost for support rather than insight and the like. And then the second one is you see a lot of people, it's like whistling past the graveyard. They set up their business and they have a tool that they like and they have used a bit, and then they will tell the rest of the world, this is exactly the tool to use. It's a little bit like the folks who write books titled How to Make $1 Million. What their book's really about is how they made $1 million and it worked for them and they'd like to share it with the rest of the world. But there are a lot of different ways to make a profit. There are also a lot of different ways to, forgive me, be a prophet and look into the future.
And so can you tell us a little bit about what the risk then of focusing too heavily on the tool might be over and above focus on process and outcomes?
Well, the risk is that you're going to miss something. So the way I view foresight is that you're not predicting an outcome. Sometimes you get lucky and you actually do that. But the point of foresight is to map a cone of uncertainty extending out from the present. So foresight is about fully appreciating uncertainty and then saying, what are the causal possibilities leading outwards, and how do you navigate it? Because the cone of uncertainty is also the cone of possibility. You know, this whole idea of, gee, if I just had a better tool, I could predict the future. Well, that's chasing a kite string you'll never catch, for the simple reason that the future is contingent. The outcomes in the future depend upon events that have not occurred yet. And so when you look into the future, thinking of the cone of possibility, the point is that you're identifying potential contingencies and assessing their probability. A lot of people, two things happen. When futurists get together, they all sit around and tell each other lies about how good their forecasts were. Or if you're at a cocktail party, as happened to me, someone says, "So how'd your predictions do?" And And if they're actually interested in the answer, I say, the test is not, did I get the outcome right? Sometimes I'm lucky. The test is, did I fully appreciate the uncertainty? And there are some events where, by sheer luck, I absolutely nailed what happened. But I thought the cone was pretty narrow. And then I looked back with some sense of terror and realized it was much broader. Things were much more uncertain. And I had just had the good fortune to point to the random walk path that came to the outcome.
And how about in your own practice? So you talk about looking back and the narrowness or the breadth of the cone. What do you draw on? What works in terms of your own practice for thinking about the future?
So elaborate on the question.
So you've talked a little bit about likening foresight to Polynesian navigation.
Oh, earlier. Yeah, well, so I have an interest in navigation quite separately from my professional work. But navigation is actually a pretty nice metaphor. Maps are a good metaphor as well. That, there are two kinds of maps in our lives. They're the ones that everything's filled in and you're planning to take a vacation, up north of Wellington somewhere, and you look at the road map and it tells you exactly where to go. And these days you have an AI that tells you where to turn. There are the other maps that have white spaces, and at the most they have a bunch of information on a white space, and somewhere out there it says, "Here be dragons." Those are futurists' maps. We're mapping a white space, and the point of foresight is to slap some reference lines on that so you know how to explore. Well, in the history of navigation, there are several very different traditions. There's the Western tradition of mathematical navigation and sextants and now GPS and the like, where you're using fairly narrow information narrow bits of strong information to tell you exactly where you're going. The Polynesian tradition, the great voyages across the Pacific, navigators were using lots of weak information. Star paths, the setting stars along the horizon, feeling the wave set beneath the boat. So they're integrating lots of weak information together to get a strong view of where they're going. And also wonderfully counterintuitive things that, when Cook and the Western explorers first encountered the Polynesian navigators, and they were astounded at how good these navigators were. Frankly, they were better than the Europeans. And they said, how do you figure out how to miss the island? How do you not miss the island? And the navigators looked at him and said, "What do you mean miss the island? We don't go past the island. The island goes past us." It's a fundamentally different worldview. And that view of being comfortable with looking at lots of weak information and aggregating it together into a really solid intuitive view of things, that's exactly how a forecaster should think. And that's why, never use just one method. Don't get over attached to one method that seems particularly familiar. Use lots, use the appropriate tool.
And that's a hard thing to do, to not get attached to a particular method, I think, once you feel like you've mastered it, when you've built that muscle around a method. So how do you encourage people to experiment with the tools that they use and draw on?
And not get over attached?
And not get over attached.
Well, the tendency with all of us is if something works, we tend to keep doing it until it doesn't work. And so when you start using a tool and you get, again and again, you get comfortable with it, scenario planning is the single most overused tool these days. Is say, I know this is going to break at some point, so I better try something else before it breaks.
And so can you talk maybe a little bit about scenario planning is a good example of a tool that you think isn't quite going to cut it forever. Are there other tools that you have particular concern around, or ones that you think are serving a good purpose for the time right now?
Well, it's a little bit like the famous quote by Murray Gell-Mann, where he said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Yeah. And that's my posture towards tools. All tools are inadequate, but some are useful. And so it really depends on the circumstance that you're doing things. And in my practice, I use a full range of tools, and in my teaching with students, everything from, very strictly mathematical. The good Reverend Bayes has been very, very good to me. Bayesian is a very powerful tool in foresight, all the way out to ethnographic techniques, a very, very powerful way, tool, if you will, is ethnographic interviews. The process, just like an ethnographer visiting an unfamiliar culture, you look for experts. And an expert is comprised of two things: their formal expertise, but also a knack for observation and drawing conclusions about the world they live in. And in between that is just about everything you can imagine.
And I've heard you talk about the fact that we actually need to be democratizing these skills around futures thinking and foresight.
Democratizing.
Yeah, so it doesn't, interesting word. But so that it doesn't sit with just foresight practitioners.
At this particular moment in history, given what's going on in the world, when you say the word democracy, it reminds me of Gandhi's famous quip when he arrived in London after he'd become famous, and a reporter rushed up to him and said, Sir, what do you think about Western civilization? And he paused and he said, I think it'd be a very good idea.
That's good. I like it. Let's not use that word. So let's talk about making foresight accessible. Yeah. To more people.
Well, there are a lot of forecasters who, the temptation is to become like the Wizard of Oz. Do not look behind the screen. I am the great and almighty Wizard of Oz. Well, I think what we need to do as forecasters is to lift the screen, to not conceal the reality of these methods. And the most effective foresight when you're working with someone to do a foresight project is to show them the tools and show them the process. And at some level, the difference between a prediction and a forecast, I learned this from one of my early mentors, Roy Amara, is prediction, you just want to see the result. And you don't particularly care. Did they use tea leaves or crystal balls or sheep entrails? Of course, we don't do sheep entrails in California. That's politically incorrect. But a forecast, you do not merely give the outcome. You reveal the process of how you got there, so that you're supporting robust intuition, and you're also helping the client do the work for themselves.
Interesting. Can I ask you a little bit about your role as co-editor for the Futures Research Methods 4.0?
So the Future Research Methods is a document. It used, once upon a time, it was a disk. You remember CD-ROMs. That's how old it is. And this is something created by the Millennium Project, and Jerry Glenn in particular, and Ted Gordon, who sadly, he just passed away in his early 90s. And this is decades old. And what it is a collection of just under 50 methods, and one chapter per method.
Wow. And
each one, for the most part, each of those chapters was written by the person who developed the method. So Ted Gordon, along with Olaf Helmer, was they were the ones who created Delphi method. So the chapter on Delphi was written by Ted, and it's gone through 3 iterations. 3.0 is about 15 years old, and Jerry and I are the co-editors. We're just embarking on updating it to 4.0. So all of the chapters will be updated, and in addition, we're going to add in new chapters on methods and the like. So watch this space for about 12 months ago.
Yeah.
Or 12 months from now, not ago.
What are you noticing around change in the tools that we're using to think about the future?
What am I noticing around change?
Yeah, so you've talked about this futures method resource being around for 30, 40 years. What have you noticed in terms of change
this
over
moment in time?
Yeah.
Well, I think of it, again, as a forecaster, I'm focused on understanding and appreciating uncertainty. And you can almost think of moments in the flow of history that uncertainty is like a manifold. It expands and contracts. And there are moments when the uncertainty decreases, and then there are moments when it widens out. The fall of the Berlin Wall, at that point, uncertainty just went right off the scale, and it was anyone's guess what would happen. Jump out 6 months, a year after the fall of the wall, then things settled back down into a moment of where we could begin to start seeing glimpses of what the future direction is like. To my great dismay, events in the United States have a disproportionate impact on populations around the world who have no voice in the American elections. And this is a moment where the outcome of our most recent election has thrown the world into a state of uncertainty that's almost as great as the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so this is, it's a time when, well, part of it is, as a forecaster, I have learned there are moments when it's best not to make a forecast. And so everybody is rushing to talk about what all this means about the election. And my advice is to quietly assess and look, and don't jump to any conclusions yet. But one of the most important tools in being an effective forecaster is to begin by deeply understanding the present. And this is a moment where it's a good idea, as my mother would say to me when I was a child, to be very small and very quiet and listen very, very carefully for the whisperings of what's coming ahead.
How am I going to say this? And as a population, are we very good at listening, in your experience, working with people and teaching and foresight and facilitation?
So, as a population, have we become better at foresight?
No. Are we listening? So we're listening for weak signals. We're being very quiet.
No, we're not. No, we're not. That's not. And that's why we need forecasters. That's why we need futurists, is people who can, the term noise, signal and noise is way overused. There are lots of people who use things that they do not understand the words. But using that notion of signal and noise in the sense that Claude Shannon wrote about in his classic mathematical theory of communication is, how do you pick out the signal from the ever-rising noise in time? Most people just get distracted by the eternal present, and the rise of social media and digital media has made it much, much, much harder. So a lot of people live, sitting there in the breakfast room this morning at our hotel, and I was taking some notes in my journal. This, by the way, is an essential forecasting tool. It looks terribly old-fashioned, and it's paper. It's not because I'm old and square. I've had an email address on my business card since 1982, and I have, first AI company I worked for was in 1984. It's a case of the appropriate tool for the job. Mm-hmm. But I digress. We get distracted by the eternal present, the eternal distraction of the latest tweet or the like. And being a good forecaster, and by forecaster, I mean everyone, not just forecast professionals, is you have to learn how to step out of the stream of the present tense noise and distraction and look for the long term.
Okay, I'm going to get practical now. So you talk about understanding the deep present, and you've got your notebook to capture some of those signals. Where do you look? How often do you do it?
It never stops. I'm just wired in a way that I'm constantly doing this. I've been married just over 30 years, and I like to think my spouse married me because of my boyish good looks. It turns out she just had a soft spot for nerds. And I remember we took a little mini vacation literally the day after our wedding, and we're driving up the North Coast, and I saw something odd on the side of the road, and I paused and I asked her permission if I could take a U-turn, and I turned around and I took a picture of it, and we had a very lovely mini honeymoon. But I spent the whole weekend thinking, what did that mean? What was the significance of that thing that I saw? And I spare you the details of it. It was a sign on the side of the road. the thing that I'm constantly doing is I'm very sensitized to things that don't seem to fit, things that seem out of place, things that seem slightly odd. And I always have a camera with me. It's nice to have a smartphone, but I always have a real camera. And I always have some paper to make a quick scribble. And there's this, if you learn to look, there is a steady flow, leakage of indicators coming down with hints of the future. Most people tend to ignore things that don't fit into a framework. So we're sitting here, and imagine you suddenly hear the sound of galloping hooves. So we're here in Dubai. First reaction might be, well, those are camels. But it wouldn't be camels because camels have nice soft pads. They don't make galloping noises. So the second reaction is it must be horses. But would you say zebras or unicorns? And so when you see something that seems odd, the first thing you do is don't jump to conclusions. Say, is there something deeper going on? Because at the end of the day, methods are tools, but at the end of the day, foresight is common sense, systematically applied to understanding the future. And our species has been doing it forever. You and I are sitting here. Everybody in this room is sitting here because each one of us came from an unbroken line of ancestors who were really good once upon a time at noting, the lion in the grass or the like. And if just one of your ancestors had screwed up and not been able to forecast where the danger was, you wouldn't be sitting here.
I've heard it said that it's not a supply side issue when it comes to understanding the future. So meaning that we have an influx of trend reports that are at us all of the time. We have so much information to scan through. What we lack is an ability to sense make that information. Is that something that lands with you? Do you agree, or do you think that you can?
I'm just I also am a little uneasy with terms like sense making. It was a good term when it first appeared, but a lot of people tend, and I'm not saying you do this, but this is what we all need to be on guard for, is do we use terms that sort of skate over something we haven't looked at deeply? I think what's gone on here is it's the challenge of the power of our tools keeping up with the complexity of our environment. If you look at the recent history of foresight, and by recent I say starting post-World War II, the early work at Rand, Herman Kahn and the like, what they did was they looked at the post-war world and they said, it's become a very complex world, and we need more powerful tools for assessing what's ahead than we've had in the past. And so they took tools from operations research and the like, and they started applying them into high complexity, high uncertainty environments. And those tools worked really fine for a while until the mid-60s, when society had become so much more complex that the tools fell short. And then we did another generation of tools. And we had the era where Delphi technique worked. Then we had Peter Schwartz and Jay Ogilvy, who's here, develop out scenario tools. And those worked fine until the early 90s. And Tim Berners-Lee complexified everything by giving us the World Wide Web. And then once again, our tools felt a little inadequate. So we're in a moment in time where, by nature, we're walking backwards into the future. We're trying to apply the old tools to this new, ever more complex environment.
Now, is there anything that is exciting you? We're at a gathering of futurists who are interested in future scenarios. What is the future scenario that you hope to see around how we use futures tools and foresight tools? What does good look like?
So what's my hope for the profession?
What is your hope?
I think the whole futures field is in deep crisis and doesn't realize it. That everybody's so busy trying to look ahead, they haven't looked at the profession. And you see it, where a lot of young futurists seem to think their path professionally is to hang out a shingle, call themselves a futurist, talk about the method they use, and look for clients. And it's not working. My short answer to anyone who wants to be a futurist is don't. Think of future skills as a skill set that you apply to another area. At some level, futurists are bystanders. And this is a world where we need the best and the brightest not to be bystanders, but full participants in helping shape the future. So take future skills, apply them into a specific field you're passionate about. To me, the success of the field of futures is that we won't have futurists because everybody will be a futurist. When I started in this business, back when dinosaurs ruled the landscape in 1984, and I joined a think tank in Silicon Valley, you could have taken all the prominent futurists on the planet and sat them around a table in a Chinese restaurant. And then you could have taken all the other futurist practitioners and filled all the rest of the tables in that same Chinese restaurant. Today, you cannot shake a stick without finding someone who calls themselves a futurist. And that's good news. If everybody considers themselves a futurist, that's a very happy result, because everybody needs to be thinking about the consequences of the present and the world we're headed into.
That's lovely. I think that's a really lovely note to wrap up on. So, Paul, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And if we could give thanks for Paul from the audience. Thank you.
Fun to hang out. Thank you.
A great convo, and you'd heard and read a lot about Paul before the podcast, so was he what you expected?
For the most part, yes. I was so impressed with how tight he was in terms of his ability to cut straight to the point, and often find a metaphor that he could use to help describe what might otherwise be quite a complex message. And that's a tough thing to do. It's not something I've managed to crack yet.
And any key points from the conversation that stuck with you?
Yeah, again with the metaphors. So he made a comment about the fact that foresight tools, can be used like a drunk uses a light post for support, not insight. And I think that's a really beautiful and spot on reminder to us all who are drawing on these tools that we actually need more. We need better, bigger thinking if we want to be able to explore and act on multiple possible futures.
Interesting. So form needs to follow function.
Yeah, we need to think about the why. What is the question that we're asking? And then how do we choose how we go about, scaffolding what we use to be able to answer that question.
And you're not used to getting immediate feedback on the podcasts. Did you chat to any of the audience members afterwards?
We did, and it was a really nice opportunity to get that immediate feedback, which, as you say, we just don't get, but also the positivity and the interest to hear this new perspective around tools, rather than that they're the be-all and end-all, but, the how we should use them, how we should think critically about how we use them. And those conversations and those questions are just super valuable, and all the better to be having in person.
Well, this is one of two special episodes that you recorded at the Dubai Future Forum, so we'll look forward to sharing the next one. But for now, thanks so much for listening to the Futures Workshop. We'll see you next time.
Ka kite, see you later.